So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Well, that is not where I want to be. Just got. Give me a second here. There we go. Okay. Alrighty. So let's talk about this pertinent topic, how to doubt your doubts. Now, just to let you know, I think some of you have probably seen this before, but there are free online resources you could read about this topic. The two books on the right here, Dealing with Doubt by Gary Habermas and his book, The Thomas Factor, are available for free online. So if you want to go deeper on this topic and you want free reading without having to pay anything, of course, that's what free means. You can read these online. They're really good resources. Gary Habermas is a Christian apologist and also an historian. He's written a lot on the resurrection of Jesus, but he has made these books available. And I would say that these two are really good. They're great resources, but I'm just happy that they're free. The one on the other side, Doubting Toward Faith, is not free, but I'll mention that book in a minute. But anyway, so just use those resources if you want to go deeper. There's a lot in there you can unpack online. So take advantage of it, okay? All right. Now, these are some other good books. An older book called Proper Confidence, Faith, Doubt, and Certainty in Christian Discipleship. And then another book by Alistair McGrath called Doubting. That came out a ways back. So those are decent books. If you have to pay some money for them, they're not free. And then I would say that it wouldn't hurt to dive into the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. I think that you will see that some of the spiritual warfare we deal with is related to this, because a lot of it takes place in our minds, right? So if you haven't read the Screwtape Letters, definitely read it. I read it a long time ago. Actually, I'm going to go back and read it soon. And also you can get the doodle online. You can watch Screwtape Letters Doodle by C.S. Lewis. There's a bunch of doodles for the Screwtape Letters online. They're pretty cool. They illustrate them and draw them out. It's really cool. So Os Guinness says that we live in an age of doubt, disillusion, and disaffiliation, which naturally prizes what has been described as the faith that you go to when you don't know where to go. Both our pluralistic and secularized culture has produced a fragilized self as it pertains to doubt. And he is correct. C.S. Lewis once said that, he once said, now that I'm a Christian, I do have moods in which the whole thing looks very improbable, but when I was an atheist, I had moods in which Christianity looked terribly probable. So, that's a good quote about how sometimes our moods sometimes get in the way of reality, and they sometimes dictate reality, right? We'll talk about that more as we go on here. So when Bobby Conway wrote this book, Doubting Towards Faith, A Journey Towards Confident Christianity, Bobby is a pastor and does some apologetic work. But, he wrote this book, and this is what he said in it. Do we really need a whole book on doubt? Is this really a huge issue in the church today? In a word, yes, it really is. We live in a multi-texture culture that is replete with innumerable beliefs, opinions, ideas, and life philosophies. Ours is a culture of doubt and longing, faith and questioning, searching and probing. And much of the doubt has been accelerated by fast-paced change. Our culture is living between the tension of what we once were and what we are now becoming. And he's right. Our culture is shifting all the time. It's moving forward. It's changing constantly. We're bombarded with social media. We're bombarded with just constant change. And it's fast. It's really fast. And we're hearing things probably in our circles of influence or our work environments or other places. As I'll say a little later on, people can Google anything now online. They just look up something, they Google it. You don't need to be an expert anymore. You can just Google anything and then it's settled sometimes. Like, look, I read this online. Well, that's settled. I can tell you how many people I've done witnessing to that just seem to think that they read something online and that just settles the whole thing, whatever it is they're thinking about or whatever doubt they have. So it's unfortunate. The internet can be a good thing, but it can also be a very negative thing. but the internet is certainly causing a lot of the problems, just the access to so much information. And people, unfortunately, don't have the tools to sift through it, and they don't have the discernment nor the background to know what they're reading is false, true, what the problems are with it, how to do critical thinking and other things. So creates a lot of challenges in today's world, especially to Christians and ministry leaders and all kinds of people. So when David Kinnaman wrote the book, He Lost Me a Ways Back, this is written, I think, a ways back, like 2007 or 8. I'm trying to remember, 2007 or 8 or 9. But when he wrote this book, Why Young Christians Are Leaving the Church and Rethinking the Church, he said, young adults with Christian experience may say the church is not a place that allows them to express doubts. They do not feel safe, admitting that sometimes Christianity does not make sense. In addition, many feel that the church's response to doubt is trivial. Some of the perceptions in this regard include not being able to ask my most pressing life questions in church and having significant intellectual doubts about my faith. And so he's right. I mean, it's true that, many Christians are probably afraid to express their doubts to other Christians or ministry leaders because it may come across as having lack of faith, or, they come across as being worried or perplexed or uncertain or weak faith. And many Christians, instead of being slow to judge, they're quick to judge, and they assume, well, here's the problem. You have sin in your life, and that's the reason why you have doubt. It's just that easy, right? But, it can be very multifaceted. And so one thing that you really don't want to assume or say to someone is, just give these kind of easy answers like, you just need to pray about it, or you must have a secret sin in your life, or you think too much, or Jesus said we need to have faith of a child. Faith is about heart knowledge, not head knowledge. All these are really overly simplistic and, quite frankly, dumb, to be honest, because, when the first three are ridiculous, because you're assuming the person must have sin in their life. I mean, they could, obviously, they very well could be true. But, or you think too much is really not going to help, because you're creating the image and likeness of God, and he made us thinking beings. And, I don't think God wants us to be like dumb, like just we don't use our brains and just be like, oh, well, I don't want to think too much about my faith. I mean, God wouldn't like that. And when Jesus said we need to have faith of a child, if you read the context of that passage, he's not talking about being gullible and really immature in your faith. He's just talking about your attitude about humility. You need to have an attitude of humility towards God. And of course, the heart knowledge, head knowledge thing is silly, because the Bible doesn't teach that. The heart encompasses all you are, encompasses your whole being, your intellect, your emotion, and your will. So there is no dichotomy with the heart in the Bible. The heart is the totality of who you are. So that's kind of silly. Now, sometimes, as I said, what kills Christians with doubts, of course, sometimes we can't ask questions adequately. The churches will not deal with their questions, or else sometimes churches or even families maybe just insulate their people. It means that they just don't even want to deal with it. They just kind of like, they protect them and won't let them ask questions. And Islam is very much like that. When I've dealt with talking to Muslims, I mean, they won't let them ask any questions. They over-insulate them and protect them because they don't want them to possibly think that there could be a problem with Islam. And sometimes that same thing can happen with the church too. Sometimes churches create a climate of fear, or sometimes you just give overly simplistic answers. Okay, and so that can be a problem. Now, one thing that I've noticed over the years, that people that seem to think that they've got the big gotcha thing, something that came up like, oh, I couldn't get over this doubt, and this is my reason why I'm drifting towards skepticism or atheism or agnosticism. One thing you might want to ask yourself, or ask the person, if you're doing someone, over the last 2,000 years since Jesus rose from the dead, is it really true nobody's ever attempted to answer any of these questions? Nobody has ever written anything or spoken on this topic or done anything? Is it really true that nobody has ever addressed that issue? And if they have, why is it that you haven't looked into it? And if so, if you don't find those answers satisfying, that's one thing, but have you ever even looked at it, right? Are these really new questions? And then, of course, for some people, They think that faith means to have absolute certainty. They think that's what faith is. That's not what faith is in the Bible. Faith is trust in God, of course, but it doesn't mean to have an exhaustive certainty or to have absolute certainty. I'll explain more of that in a minute. And, there could be some people who are just looking for reasons not to believe. Could be reasons some people are just like looking for reasons to leave, to get away from the faith they were raised in, or just to turn away from God. It could be that, right? Definitely that can happen. But when you're not confident in your faith, if it's a certain issue you're struggling with, it may be time just to buckle down harder and study more. Okay. I have found over the years that many people simply are really lazy when it comes to their faith. Like they'll spend hours on Netflix and hours watching sports or on the internet or social media, or reading about politics or investing their time in a social issue, but they can't seem to put that same amount of time into study their faith or really dive deep into a topic they're struggling with. So in some cases, it's just an issue if they don't want to dig deeper. In some places, many areas of theology, many areas of our faith, we have to dig deep. And for a very impatient culture that wants quick answers, wants soundbite answers, and wants to just Google it, that's just too hard. I don't want to dig deep. I don't want to take the time. So, if I'm not sure, if I'm not confident Jesus really rose from the dead, I don't know how to articulate that to somebody. That's just too much work. I don't want to take the time to find out or get good reasons behind why the central tenet of my faith, which is Jesus' resurrection, why that's actually true. That's unfortunate because the reward would be great if you would just dig deeper. I guarantee you that you will have an enriched faith, you'll have a strengthened faith, you'll have a confident faith, and you will benefit in so many ways. But in some cases, we just don't want to put in the time. And part of that is spiritual warfare, because Satan loves a dumbed down church, and Satan loves a non-confident believer. He likes a believer that is not confident and is constantly walking in a unstable relationship with God and constantly in a state of doubt all the time. The enemy can't, that person can't really do a lot of damage for God's kingdom. So, that's why Satan likes to keep people kind of paralyzed in some places, paralyzed through a doubt or something they're struggling with. So, sometimes you just got to take the time. You got to put the time in to dig deeper. And as I said, it'll pay off. That's a great book, by the way, if you want to start studying more on the resurrection. So sometimes what happens is when we're overburdened with doubts, it can cause despair. And then, of course, it can lead to departure. It means that we just depart from the faith, or we think we're breaking up with God. We basically have decided that, well, I'm going to break up with God now. I've had a relation with God for 20 years, but this doubt is just hurting my faith, and therefore, God, I'm done with you. Well, I got news for you. Just because you don't believe in God anymore doesn't mean he doesn't exist. And just because you don't believe anymore Jesus rose from the dead doesn't mean he didn't rise from the dead. Your faith has nothing to do with that. He either rose from the dead or he didn't rise from the dead, and God exists or he doesn't exist. He was there before you believed it, and Jesus rose from the dead before you believed it as well. And he's still risen from the dead, even if you don't believe it, because that's an historical claim. It's not based on your faith. Your faith only appropriates what's already written in the Bible. It only appropriates what God has revealed to you. You don't create faith. You don't make God exist through your faith. You don't make Jesus rise from the dead. It's not magic. Okay? All right. So some people are into this trend called deconstructionism, and that's where they kind of deconstruct their faith, which is related to doubting. That's where they're going through this process of questioning, doubting, and rejecting aspects of the Christian faith, and then they tend to maybe hold on to some of them, but they're also dismantling some of them. So they basically are questioning all their core beliefs. Okay, and that's what they mean to deconstruct, is to evaluate, look at what you believe and say, I'm going to deconstruct this and see what's left. And so they sometimes, what they do is They seek out other people that are doing that. They look for resources to help them deconstruct. And then they don't really know how to reconstruct their faith. And so this is very trendy today. A lot of Christians are raised in churches, raised in Christian homes, maybe didn't have a lot of good reasons for what they believe, why they believed. Then they reach a certain age, they say, why do I really even believe Jesus rose from the dead? Why do I think the Bible's the Word of God? Why do I really believe that Jesus is the only way of salvation? Why do I even believe homosexuality is wrong in the Bible? I was taught that by my parents. I was taught that by the church. But I need to deconstruct that now and figure out what I believe. Now, guess what? It's okay to deconstruct your faith in that way. If you're thinking about for the first time what you believe and why you believe, you need to do that. If you don't know what you believe and why you believe, you need to do that at some point. But that doesn't mean that you're trying there's a healthy way of doing that. The negative way is where you're doing it to destruct, where you're just basically you're looking for reasons to leave your faith, leave Christianity, right? Now, if you take it in a positive way and you say, okay, I'm going to figure out what I believe, why I believe, and I'm going to reconstruct my faith, that's fine, as long as your goal is to reconstruct it. But if you're going to look for reasons to not believe anymore, and that's what your goal is, then obviously that's the destructive phase of it, right? Now, the one thing that we always need to remember is that sometimes in life you run into people or know people, or maybe you don't, but I do. Some people like to give their testimonies, about maybe why they left Christianity for atheism, or vice versa, why they left atheism for Christianity. Okay, and so I personally don't find these really compelling. When I find popular atheists that get online and they talk about their testimony, I was raised in a Christian home and now I'm an atheist and here's why, blah, 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 blah. That's not really that compelling to me. Not at all, really. I don't really care about your testimony, to be honest. Really is not going to be a factor for me in whether Christianity is true, okay? Because you know what? For every atheist that does that, I can find former atheists that became Christians as well. Well-known former atheists went on to be biblical scholars, apologists, philosophers, scientists, theologians, whatever. So at the end of the day, that doesn't really do much. Okay. At the end of the day, the bottom line is who has the better evidence, and what's the evidence for Christianity? And that's what I want to know. I'm not so concerned about your journey out of atheism to Christianity, your journey out of Christianity to atheism. I mean, yeah, it's nice to hear. It's fine if you want to tell it, but that doesn't change whether Jesus rose from the dead. It doesn't change whether God exists, okay? So your testimony doesn't change the facts, okay? All right. Now, remember that when you have questions about things, those aren't necessarily doubts. I still don't understand the Trinity 100%, and I study it, and I still have questions about the Trinity. I still have questions about certain aspects of the Bible. I still have questions about how God's sovereignty works with man's free will, how God can be in time and out of time. How does a uncaused cause, create an entire universe and planet Earth and everything? I don't know if I have all those questions answered exhaustively. I think I have reasonable answers, but it's okay to have questions. It doesn't necessarily mean you're doubting all the time. Just because you have questions, you don't understand something, okay? But remember, every belief system has questions. Every one of them. Every worldview has questions, whether it be atheism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Marxism, humanism, whatever it is. They all have questions. They have things that are not resolved completely, and asking questions is part of the human story. So like William Lane Craig says here, the secret to dealing with doubt in the Christian life is not to resolve all of one's doubts. One will always have unanswered questions. But the secret is learning to live victoriously with one's unanswered questions, okay? So you're probably not going to get every question answered exhaustively in this lifetime, okay? If you do, then you're the first one to do it, okay? So if you you say, I've resolved all those questions, well, email me and I'll send you about 20 more and see how you do with them, okay? So that's just part of life. Like I said, just dealing with questions that aren't answered perfectly. Now, you may say to yourself, is there anything positive about doubt? I mean, in the church, doubt's viewed as a very negative thing, right? But can there be anything positive about it? And the answer is yes. Yes, yes, yes. You're like, no, can't be. Well, obviously, when you doubt something, it sometimes can prevent you from reaching hasty conclusions or making commitments to unreliable sources, right? When you just suspend judgment on something, you could say, well, I'm suspending judgment until I get more information, right? Before more evidence is presented, and then I'll make a commitment to that thing, right? Um, of course, you can't hold back sometimes. Sometimes judgments have to be made, right? Decisions have to be made. But I think for all of us, probably we're all pretty skeptical towards other religions and other beliefs. Um, there's like a common sense skepticism we all have towards a Mormon that comes to our door, a Jehovah Witness that comes to our door, a Muslim that tries to convert us, or an atheist that tries to talk to us. We all seem to exercise some sort of common sense skepticism, right? And that's not a bad thing. The problem is you get into is number two here, hyper skepticism, where you won't commit to something until you get every question answered exhaustively. That's where it gets a little dicey, okay? And so some people are over number two, and they say, well, I'm just going to stay skeptical until I get every single question answered perfectly. And so sometimes people want that exhaustive knowledge. You want every question answered, every gap in knowledge answered. They don't like to live with any tension. If they can't get any absolute certainty, they can't reconcile it. And so this comes into the problem of we don't do a great job in the churches because they think it's all for just philosophy, but we don't really teach much on what we call religious epistemology, and that's the study of how we know things, like how you gather knowledge, like how do you know something's true. And just remember, as I said before, to have faith, if you think that have faith means have 100% certainty, that's not what the Bible teaches, okay? Biblically speaking, faith is not to have the highest degree of psychological confidence, okay? Now, when you make commitments, as I'll show you one in a second, you may not have the highest level of confidence you want. You may have some confidence, or maybe you have a level of confidence that satisfies you. For example, if you go, I'll go back to those in a minute. Like if you can get engaged someday, and you have knowledge, you think that your spouse is right for you, you still have probably some gaps in knowledge and some level of uncertainty because you can't see into the future. You don't know if this is going to perfectly work out. You don't know how it's going to work out for a family, kids, all that stuff. But, the reality of it is that most of us have to take a step and commit, even without perfect certainty or perfect knowledge, okay? And the same thing happens with big job commitments. You go to take a job, you interview, and the person says, give me, you tell your employer or the guys interviewing you that I need a week to think about this. And they say, yeah, get back to us in a week. Think about it. The job's available to you if you want to come back to us in a week and take the job. But, you think about it. You're like, this is what's good about the job. This is bad about the job. Is this going to work out? Is the company going to get sold? Is the company going to go under? Is it a good product? Is this the right thing? Is it the best place to live? Is the schedule? You have some gaps of knowledge and some levels of uncertainty and things you can't completely resolve before you have to commit to that job. Otherwise, you never have a job, right? And that's the way it is. A lot of big commitments in life, we don't have 100% certainty, but we still commit. That's the way most of life is, to be honest. And so what we sometimes do is we gather more information. We gather more information, think about it, gather more information, think about it. Sometimes gather more information, think about it. But eventually a decision has to be made, right? We have to commit. Okay. And so it just life doesn't work that way where we can be absolutely 100% certain every time before we commit. Okay. So remember, biblical faith, believing faith, is definitely something you do with your mind. It has to do with your cognition, like the way you think. Like if I believe cognitively in my mind before I got married that, yeah, I believe this is the right spouse for me. My mind tells me that this is the right one for me and I'm going to commit. But when I have that believing faith cognitively in my mind, I still don't have trusting faith yet. And so when I went to get married, or you go to get married, maybe you do, maybe you don't, or take a job, whatever it is, that job analogy I gave, you exercise your volitional will. You have to exercise your will where you trust and step out, right? Just like on the wedding day, you take that step of trust and believe in your spouse and commit to them, right? You move from just having a cognitive understanding of your spouse to a complete commitment, right? And you know what? Your job employer wants 100% commitment from you, and your spouse probably wants 100% commitment from you as well. And you don't even have 100% certainty that this is the right job or the right spouse. You may still have some gaps of knowledge, but you still have to give 100% commitment, right? You can tell your employer, well, I don't have 100% certainty it's the right job, but I'll give you an 80% commitment to the job. What do you think they're going to say? I don't want you. I want 100% commitment. I want to know you're all in. Are you all in or not? Yeah, I'm all in. Deep in the back of your mind, you're going, I'm not sure if this is the right job. It kind of looks like it. I don't know. Maybe, yeah, kind of. Okay, I'll commit. Or it could be something else. There's all kinds of analogies, right? Now, so what I want you to realize is that in some ways, all Christians are doubters. You may say, no, we're not. I don't have any doubt. I have faith, and God thinks I'm great. But you are doubtful. You have major doubts about Mormonism, Islam, atheism, spiritualism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Marxism, secular humanism. The list goes on. Okay, I doubt when Mormons try to convert me, I doubt what they're telling me is true because I've looked into it and I think they don't have good evidence for their claims. Same thing with Muslims, same thing with atheists, same things as all those other ones I mentioned. So I'm highly doubtful what they're telling me is true. Okay, so you do doubt everything else. Okay, except your faith, except maybe Christianity, maybe still doubts. So I'm saying everybody's doubtful about another belief system. Okay, no doubt about it. Hey, notice that? For example, if a Muslim comes to me and says they want to try to convince me Islam is based on a true revelation, and I look at all these first century, second century, third century sources that say Jesus was crucified, but then they tell me, well, the Quran says that Jesus wasn't crucified, because that's the Quran most Muslims believe. Jesus was not physically crucified. They think it was someone made to look like Jesus. They don't think it was really Jesus. So they think all the first century, second century, third century sources are false. They think the disciples were deceived and it wasn't really Jesus. So when a Muslim's trying to tell me this, I am definitely going to raise up a red flag and say, I definitely doubt what you're telling me is true because there's too much evidence that Jesus was really crucified, right? Okay, I think we probably know that. Now, remember, you can know something without being certain about it and even having doubt. Like I could say, like I just gave these analogies, like I said in number 2 here, if you go to take a marriage or go to get married or take a job, you may say, I know this is the right one for me. I know this fiance is the right one for me. I know this job is the right choice. But it doesn't mean I have absolute certainty, right? I may still have some unanswered questions, but I still say, I know this is the right one for me. You may say, I believe government won't collapse, and I believe I'll graduate from college, and I believe I'll get a decent job. You believe that, but you can still have doubts in the back of your mind. I mean, I have doubts government will collapse. I still have some beliefs government probably could collapse. So the point is you can still have some doubts in relationship to saying you know something and even saying you believe something. Okay. Now, doubt in the Bible, if you remember, when Peter doubted Jesus's ability to keep him from drowning, that had to do with like a small or weak faith, right? Peter became doubtful as to Jesus's ability to sustain him, right? To save him, right? That kind of doubt in the Bible is the bad kind of doubt, right? Where it's not trusting God's promises. That's obviously not something that Jesus liked or God looked upon favorably, right? But we see it out through the Bible. People doubt the promises of God or what he says, right? Jesus says, Peter, believe, right? I mean, the disciples had doubts. They had doubts, right? And when the Pharisees doubted Jesus' messiahship and asked for another sign, of course, they were doubting that he was a Messiah. Jesus talks about Matthew He talks about if we have faith in God and do not doubt, we can move mountains and receive our requests through prayer. But, prayer, our prayer life sometimes can be a battle with doubt, right? Where we're not sure if I really believe. Am I believing in faith when I'm praying? Am I praying in faith, or I'm not sure if God can do this. I'm not sure if God can come through. Uh, I'm in a situation with a family member where I need God's intervention. And I think God showed me the other day that I need to just believe that he's acting in our behalf. Like, I'm going to believe that he's acting in our behalf. And I'm not going to doubt that. That's a promise God's given. He is acting in our behalf in this situation. Now, there's another passage in Matthew 11, parallels Luke 7:19, where John the Baptist is in prison. He's about to be beheaded. He had seen Jesus baptized, right? He saw Jesus do these miracles. He knew who Jesus was. He believed he was the Messiah, right? He announces the kingdom of God. But John the Baptist was about to be beheaded. He's in prison and really struggling. He'd been thrown into prison by Herod. But, think about that. Here's the Messiah who's come. I've been with him. I've seen him. I've seen what he can do. But now I'm in prison. I'm about to be beheaded. I've been faithful to what Jesus called me to do. And now I'm about to die. And if you read that passage, it's funny that when the messengers, John the Baptist actually sends people to Jesus to ask him, are you really the one who has come? Or should we expect someone else? Now, wait a minute. John had already been with Jesus. He'd already spent time with Jesus. He doesn't know he's the Messiah, the expected one. Or is John just having a collapse of faith of some kind? He's about to be beheaded. He's in prison. He says, are you really the one who has come, or we should expecting someone else? Something's going on there. Was John really doubting whether Jesus was a Messiah? But notice how Jesus responds. Jesus doesn't rebuke him. If you read Matthew 11, Jesus says, go and tell John, the blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed. He tells him that I am really the one. Look at the miracles I do, prove I am the Messiah. So Jesus doesn't necessarily rebuke John for lack of faith. Now, then you had another one where you have these appearances of the resurrection appearances, right? Jesus appears to Mary. Mary tells the disciples she saw Jesus. The disciples don't believe her. Jesus appears to two others. They tell the disciples saw Jesus. The disciples don't believe them. Remember, Jesus had said he was going to die and rise from the dead. He told them, said, I'm going to rise from the dead on the third day. They're not believing, right? They had not seen Jesus yet, risen from the dead, right? But they had the doubt. Remember, Thomas, of course, doubted. We know doubting Thomas, right? Here's Thomas who said, I literally have to see his wounds. Like I have to touch his wounds. Thomas, Jesus didn't severely rebuke Thomas for his doubt, but he doesn't really commend him like, oh, Thomas, good for you. You said you needed to see my wounds. Well, here you go. Put your finger in my side and you're awesome. No, he just says, believe, right? Put your fingers here, Thomas, believe. So Jesus understood their frailty, understood that they struggled. Remember, these were first century eyewitnesses that were with Jesus. They saw what Jesus did with their own eyes, and they still struggle. Isn't that interesting? Now, generally, there are a few different kinds of doubt, and they overlap with each other. There's what we call emotional doubt. Then there's what we call factual doubt or intellectual doubt, and there's what we call volitional doubt. Now, emotional doubt has to do with our mood and our emotions, obviously. And since we are emotional creatures, our moods can tend to go up and down. And our mood swings are determined by circumstances of life and whether this happens or that happens. Some of us have struggles with depression, anxiety. Those issues are real. I'm not making fun of them at all. But the reality of it is our emotions can play a role in our faith and our doubts, okay? So sometimes the emotional doubt creeps in where we start to question whether God is good. We may be encountering unanswered prayer. And sometimes, we just expect God to do something. He doesn't do it. We thought, I thought God was going to come through for me here. I thought this prayer was going to be answered this way. And then it doesn't happen. And then we're like, well, I don't know if I can trust God, whether he's good. And so sometimes our emotions just go up and down like that, right? And, sometimes we have thoughts in our mind that creep in, like, I wonder if I'm really a believer. How can I still struggle with that same sin in my life? Am I really a regenerate, born again believer? Is the Holy Spirit indwelling me? Or what if God doesn't going to forgive me for this specific sin in my life? I did something that was so wrong. I just don't know if God can forgive me. Or how can God love me? Or how could God allow my child to be diagnosed with cancer? These are all understandable, and they are all part of emotional doubt, right? And, will God provide my financial needs? Causes us to be fearful. We have these dreadful thoughts of fear. What if I do stay single my entire life? Am I going to be able to survive if without an intimate partner? Will I make it? Will I be able to have a thriving life if I don't get married? Will God help me? Will I be able to get through this life without a life partner? Some people obviously are still single and they're still around. Some people, of course, struggle with it in severe ways. Or why did you make me this way, God? Why do I struggle with a specific thing in my life? I keep struggling with it. Or perhaps, it's the old American dream just hitting us between the eyes. I'm not going to be viewed as a success. I don't live up to the American dream. I don't have a huge job in the perfect family in the middle of suburbia. And I'm not going to retire with a lot of money in the bank, and I'm not going to be able to go play golf every day for the rest of my life in my retirement. That sadly is sometimes what the American dream is to some people, and they assume if they're not hitting it, they're a loser. And sadly, they think they don't view themselves through the lens of God, what he expects of them. They're living off the American dream because it's all around them. It's all around us all the time. It just sucks us right in, right? And that's just something that we have to fight against all the time. Not to measure ourselves by the American dream, to measure ourselves by the way God sees us, right? And then sometimes, it seems Christianity doesn't work in life. When Michael Horton wrote an article called "What Happens When Christianity Doesn't Work," we sometimes are told we come to faith that God's going to answer all our prayers, promises perfect health, wealth, and happiness, and then that doesn't work out. In some cases, Christianity doesn't seem to solve all the problems I think it should solve. I don't have a great marriage. I don't have perfect kids. I struggle in my job. I struggle in relationships. I have this issue. Just Christianity isn't working. The reality of it is, that Jesus, even if your faith is not working in a practical way, it really doesn't mean Jesus didn't rise from the dead, right? Obviously, that has no bearing on whether Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus either rose from the dead or he didn't rise from the dead. That's a fact of history that we're talking about, right? And sometimes the problem is we just don't know who God is. We're biblically illiterate in certain areas. We don't have an understanding of who God really is. We have expectations of God because we don't really know who he is and his character. And like I said, we sometimes mix it with the American dream. We assume God's purpose is to make us happy. And that's all that we're here for, is God is just there to make us happy. And there's no challenges in life. There's no self-denial, sacrifice, and all that matters is God's making me happy all the time. That's a biblically illiterate position to take, okay? And it is true that one of the triggers to doubt is certainly sin. Sin can hurt us in many ways, and it certainly can feed into our doubts. It's a combination of things. Because what happens is the more we sin and stay in sin, it just desensitizes us towards the things of God. We end up having a seared conscience. We end up desensitizing our conscience, and eventually it causes us to just not really be in tune with God, and really eventually just like, I don't know if I really believe this anymore, and I'm not sure, So yeah, if you're in persistent sin day in and day out, that definitely will impact the issues of doubt. This book called The Making of an Atheist by James Spiegel came out a ways back. This whole book is he talks about how immorality leads to unbelief. He talks about how sexual sin, which is, of course, the plague of our culture and the church as well at times, can just lead right into unbelief. Because if you just sin and sin and sin, eventually it's going to, the detector God gave you to find him is eventually just going to be tuned out. Okay, if you just continuously stay in that area. And so what happens is sometimes where the pattern starts is where we start to sin regularly. We don't take sin seriously. Sometimes we have disappointment with God in our life. God didn't come through for us. And sometimes we have these factual doubts, these doubts about the reliability of the Bible, these doubts about God's existence, these doubts about this, these doubts about that, these factual issues. And then sometimes then that feeds into us not being disciplined in our lives. We stop praying. We don't read the word. We're not involved in community. We're not pursuing God every day. So you just feed these all together, to combine them together. Eventually, it can just lead to unbelief, right? And that's what happens. So sometimes this is a pattern. All these things can combine into one big, giant disappointment, okay? So we have to do as Christians, as full-time, as disciples of the Messiah, is we have to be confessing our sins regularly. We have to repent all the time because we're constantly repenting. We have to have the right expectation of God to begin with. That means we have to study the scriptures, know the character of God. We need to be able to know we can deal with our factual doubts. There's more than enough resources to deal with many of the questions that have come along in the last 2,000 years. And we certainly have to be spiritually disciplined. If you don't pray and read the word on a regular basis, I would expect you would have an increase of doubt, okay? Because you're not going to sense God's presence in your life as much. And you're going to have it's just not a good pattern. It's just like you have to go to the gym to work out regularly, stay in shape. If you don't exercise spiritual disciplines, your relationship with God will suffer immensely, okay? Now, when it comes to intellectual factual doubt, like I said, that has to do with questions about God's existence, reliability of the Bible, maybe the factuality of the resurrection. It is true that sometimes you hear the statement, the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. That's true. In that case, it's funny how when I've seen new believers that don't know much about their faith, they haven't really studied the Bible yet, and they're just getting started. It's amazing how much more zealous and bold they are. So, it's just, it is true sometimes. The more you learn and study, the more you realize, gosh, I realize how much I really don't know. And there's just too much to learn, and you can't learn it all, right? And of course, one of the biggest triggers to doubt is the internet today. Like I said, anyone and everyone is an expert on anything. You can Google any topic. Just Google it, look it up on Wikipedia, and people say, where's a brand new argument I never heard of, and nobody's even thought about this. And then they look up people on the internet who found something else on the internet. They say, well, I'm an ex-Christian because of this. I found this on the internet. So, like I said before, sadly, the internet, while it can help some people, it also can be a curse, because some people just don't have the discernment level to sift through some of the things they're reading, and they don't want to go deeper. They don't dig deeper. They don't read books or experts on the topic. They're just reading some guy or someone who just decided to be a YouTuber out of nowhere, or they don't want to read the history of an argument. They just want a quick answer from someone on YouTube or on Wikipedia. So the internet's a huge issue today. And so it happens sometimes, I've talked about this, where everybody has this, where you believe something, you have a strong conviction about something, and then you might hear something that challenges that, and you have this dissonance in your mind. Where you say, I thought this was the thing to believe. I've always believed this, but now I'm hearing something that's different. You have to resolve that dissonance. That's what's called cognitive dissonances. Now, every belief system has this. Atheists have it. Not just religious people. We have this in politics. We have this in everything, where we thought we believe something very strongly, and then we hear a challenge to it, and then we either push it aside, or else we deal with I have to deal with this, figure out what's this counter evidence I'm hearing, right? Sometimes that can lead to growth. We have to dig deeper, right? Like I talked about before, you have to dig deeper. And then there's volitional doubt, and that has to do with your will. That is the part of you that just doesn't want to do what God wants, okay? That's the part that doesn't naturally surrender, right? So, like I said before, when you get married, you go to the altar, you made a commitment to this person, or you said you're going to marry this person. Intellectually, this person is the right person for you, right? In your mind, it tells you that. But then you get up to the altar that day, you say, I will, I do, right? You commit. So you exercise your will. Just like when the job comes and you say, I will take this job, right? Intellectually, you've known it's the right. You say, yeah, it's the right one intellectually, but then you say, now I've got to commit. I'm going to commit to this job. I'm going to exercise faith. I'm going to commit my will to this, right? And sometimes, we have a hard time exercising our will in the way God wants us to go because we don't trust God. We don't think he's good. We're not sure if he knows what's the best plan for our life. We think we're smarter, and then we end up just saying, no, I don't want to do that. So that's an issue of our will. We don't trust God, right? Pascal once said, in faith, there's enough light for those who want to believe and enough shadows to blind those who don't. And I think God probably gives us enough information to believe, but he also leaves it a little ambiguous so people have the freedom to reject him too. If he made it abundantly, absolutely 100% certain on everything, then we wouldn't need any faith, right? But he leaves things a little ambiguous here or there where we have to say, yeah, I've got some adequate evidence, but it's not 100% certain, but I'm going to go ahead and commit because I think Jesus has the best plan, and he is who he is. Okay? And, a good example of the will, exercising the will when you don't want to exercise your will and faith is analogies of doctor when a doctor tells you that exercise is really good for you. Now, you may intellectually assent to that. He said, yeah, that's true. I agree with that intellectually. Yeah, that's true what doctor said. But just because you acknowledge, you look at your dog and say, yeah, that's true, doctor. You're right, Dr. Smith, that exercise is good for me. Yeah, I agree with you intellectually. But it doesn't mean you've committed yourself to do exercise, right? It doesn't mean you've exercised your will. Just like you can acknowledge intellectually that God exists, you can acknowledge that Jesus really is the Son of God. But that doesn't mean you exercise trust or your will, right? It doesn't mean you committed to him, right? So you still have to exercise your will at some point. And we do that when we come to faith in the Lord and we commit to him, we have to exercise our will. You guys know that if you've done that, right? And then remember, God always cares about the evidence that he provides for us. Some people think God's entitled to, they're entitled to get signs from God, like he's just supposed to give them a ton of miracles and signs. He's there all the time, and they can reject what he's given to them already, which is his knowledge through creation. We can know God through the gift of creation. We can know God through historical evidence for Jesus, who Jesus is, of course, the Bible. They don't think that's good enough sometimes, and they think they're owed a sign, a real big sign. And so God's more interested in active commitment. Giving, if God gave signs to somebody and did these miracles for people so they believe, or did these things, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to commit. We know that with Jesus had that with people. He'd do miracles and they still didn't believe, right? They didn't exercise their will. And that can still happen today. Okay? So God can definitely use doubt to develop us, strengthen us, develop our dependence on him. Sometimes it may drive us out of complacency and cause us to search for answers and cause us to study harder. So obviously it can be used to draw closer to God. It also can create humility within us, where we realize sometimes everything isn't so black and white as we thought it was. And sometimes we can help others as well. And it can help us have better discernment. And because sometimes we study harder and it helps us to sift through information better, we become more seasoned, we become more mature in our faith. And then when we hear something that doesn't sound right, that doesn't sound like it's the truth, we're able to spot that out because we're sensitive to that. We've looked into it. Okay. So that's about it. I don't really have anything else to share. I think that was a decent amount, but I definitely am ready to talk. So, I got to stop